From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And coming up today from Iowa State University, Lee Schulz is featured on this week's cattle market segment. Among other things, Lee will talk about the unexpectedly high feedlot placement number in last Friday's USDA Cattle on Feed report. K-State's Ted Schroeder and Elliott will follow to report on their just-released study of the feedlot cattle health management practice called Metaphylaxis. They've attached an economic value to that approach. Today's Kansas Wheat Harvest Update features Extension Agricultural Agent Tom Maxwell of the Central Kansas Extension District. And later on this week's 4-H segment, Jeff Wickman talks animal projects with K-State's Pam van Horn. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to the Monday edition of Agriculture Today from Kansas State University. Welcome once again. First off is our weekly look at the cattle market scene, and we've quite a selection of things to pick up on this time around, including the latest USDA Cattle on Feed report. Lee Schulz is with us via phone from his office in Ames, Iowa. Lee, as you know, is a livestock economist at Iowa State University. Before we get into the cattle on feed numbers, Lee, just a quick synopsis of the fed and feeder cattle trades. If you were to use one descriptor, it could be uneventful. Is that fair to say?
That's definitely fair to say. I think the futures markets are really awaiting the cash markets for signals on where to go, and we haven't seen much action in the cash markets. Cash, we're looking at offers are in that 108. Asking's 115. We're seeing some trade kind of at the midpoint of there. We did see more distant contracts see a little bit of strength in the futures market, especially when we look at the live cattle. The near-term contract, that June contract, I think we're going to really trade in that range of that 108 as we're looking for that to expire this month. August did see a little bit of action, some increase there, but I think that's more of a convergence of the June and August contract more than anything. We're just really trading a fairly strong demand situation and relatively a known supply situation, and the market just looking for surprises.
And it may have one such surprise in the cattle on feed report out last Friday afternoon. And right to it, the placements number there exceeded what most had thought it would be by a fair bit, actually.
And the emphasis really is on most. When you look at pre-report expectations, there was a fairly large range on that, from 7% below a year ago up to about par of what last year was. There was a few analysts that expected it at par, but mostly it was below year ago levels. I think the ones that expected it at par was looking at the receipts that we've seen for feeder cattle auctions and realizing those have been very strong compared to year ago levels. And maybe that was an indication of the larger placements. But for the most part, we expected that well below year ago levels, and it came in right at about 0.2% above year ago levels. So what that means is not so much implications for the near-term prices, but more cattle expected as we get later on in the year. So I would really look at some reaction in those more distant live cattle futures contracts of the implications of more cattle.
Now, to keep in mind, the marketings figure from this report suggested that we're pretty much on pace there from what folks have been thinking.
Yeah, if you're looking at one bullish part from this, or at least maybe help steady the bearishness of the larger placements, was that we are staying relatively current in those marketings, up 5.4% compared to a year ago level. So we're not really building up cattle supplies. We are replacing them at a relatively brisk pace, but we are keeping those marketings going. So I think that's a relatively good sign that, we won't see a large purge in prices, but we're going to need to continue to see that as we're seeing larger placements than year-ago levels.
And Lee, you note that one of the catalysts for those marketings staying on pace, the strong basis levels we see in the markets currently.
Yes, that is the case. We're definitely seeing the strong basis levels be a large pull on hedged cattle, as we're seeing cattle being marketed at a little bit higher price because of those stronger basis than what we would expect using a historical average. That began in April, as we've seen some very strong basis levels relative to that April contract. Continued into June, where really you've seen very strong basis levels in May. I think that really pulled some cattle ahead from those April marketings. And then we're starting to see this continue into looking at that August contract. So realizing the June contract will expire here at the end of the month, and basis levels currently comparing cash to that August contract are very strong. So that will keep marketings at a relatively brisk pace. I think also an implication there is, given what forward contract offerings are from packers, nowhere near what those current basis levels are. So I think there is really an incentive for producers to hedge as opposed to use some of those forward contracts just because of what the market is currently offering.
This begs the natural question, how long could this strength in basis continue? Could it be for months? Could it extend into 2019? Have you any thinking on that?
Well, we know that markets converge as we get closer to expiration. And even though we've seen relatively strong basis levels, we do see that convergence as those contracts expire. So I first looking at near term here, looking at that August contract, basis levels are very strong now, but we know they will converge as we get closer into August. But we've been seeing a relatively strong basis level over the last several years. Now, that's really come apart because we've seen very strong demand, and I think we've kept that marketing pace relatively brisk, and so packers have really had to come after cattle. Going longer term here into 2019 and even beyond, I think those basis levels are going to come back more into historical levels, maybe what we experienced going back 2012 to 2016, and so that's going to have implications for how producers market, and understanding, basis levels here the last couple of years are maybe not indicative of what we're seeing going forward.
But your point is that producers should take full advantage in whatever hedging strategy that they deem fit to capitalize on this strength in basis at this present time.
Yes, that's definitely the case. When you're looking at a very strong basis, that's really a hedger's dream. So really protecting from that downside price risk and realizing stronger basis really highlights the need for risk management and even the benefit of risk management in this current market.
Very good. Want to pick up on something else that you are tracking closely here. It relates to cow herd expansion, and you're watching several market signals that might hint at if expansion is continuing, if we're seeing a leveling off or even a contraction in herd size. What things are you watching here, Lee?
Well, and these really indicators have, I think, implications, much more longer term as we look out at the future, this cow herd and the size of beef supplies, but also we're really looking at many of those indicators that are occurring right now. When you look back to the cattle report last January, it said nationally we're holding 4% fewer heifers. We're expected to calve fewer here in 2018. But that's not too unexpected, as we're kind of slowing in the herd expansion. We've also seen an increase in number of heifers on feed and number of heifers being slaughtered. But again, as expected, because we have more heifers now available for both the breeding herd as well as marketing for the beef supply chain. We're seeing a few more cows being slaughtered, but I think that's just more of the natural turnover now that we're having a lot more heifers available, and we can really turn those over in our herds. What I've really been watching and what's impacting producers' decisions this year is there's still a premium on replacement quality heifers. Mm-hmm. We've seen it really in the spring months here. When you look at feeder cattle auctions, reporters do indicate if they are destined for replacement. And those prices have been running about 9% above year-ago levels. So I think it's really been a seller's market. Producers that are producing those quality of heifers and have some maybe superior genetics, they're still seeing higher prices for those replacement females. So indication that, this expansionary phase maybe isn't quite over yet. It's definitely slowing, but putting collectively all those indicators together, I think we're seeing likely expansion here as we get into 2019. Now, important is what growing conditions, as far as forage conditions, they'll dictate a lot of what those actual replacement decisions are this fall.
And that leads to a quick look at forage concerns out there. Hay supplies questionable in many areas of the Central Plains anyway, and even further west because of dry conditions. So that's a factor that just can't be ignored in any of this, Lee.
No, it can't. We're really nationally, when you look in aggregate, May 1 hay stocks are the third lowest in the history of the data, and we have data back to 1979. We're not all that much farther tight supplies than what we've seen back in 2013, which was really a reflection of the national drought in 2012. So hay supplies are really historically tight, and we have more beef cows. So it's going to be very imperative that we have very good growing conditions to replenish that hay supply, as well as really be able to lengthen pasture growing and forage availability situation to really be able to support this increased herd size that we have.
That's going to be a story well worth monitoring as it unfolds throughout the balance of this summer, to be certain. Well, Lee, we always appreciate your observations on the markets and what's going on within them, and we'll touch base again in a few weeks. Many thanks to you.
Thank you.
And offering up this week's cattle market analysis and comment, that's Lee Schulz, livestock economist at Iowa State University. When we return in a moment, we'll hear about an enlightening new study out of K-State, which will hopefully influence decisions critical to beef cattle health management. That's next, here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and welcome back. As you cattle producers well know, there's been heightened focus in recent years on the use of antibiotics and antimicrobial treatments for cattle in health management. That has been, in part, the trigger for a new study out of the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State. Our guests now have taken a close look at the economic value of what's called metaphylaxis in fed cattle production. Joining us now, Ted Schroeder, who is a livestock economist at K-State and a graduate student in the department who carried a lot of the weight on this work, Elliott Dennis. So, Ted, we reflect back to public interest and even concern about the use of antibiotics in cattle production and the possible crossover effects on resistance to antibiotic treatments in human health. And that, in part, is what inspired this work, right?
Well, certainly, Eric, there's a sentiment and a public policy concern about whether there is and to the extent there might be crossover effects of antibiotics in human and animal health use. This study is really probably more just about the impacts of how public policies that are being dialogued and discussed could impact. It's sort of the economic potential impact of those in the fed cattle industry in particular, really isolating on antimicrobials that are used in managing fed cattle health risk especially. And
lending definition here, what is meant by metaphylaxis?
There's a lot of different variants on the definition of metaphylaxis, but for our cases, what we were really exploring here was The use of a mass treatment, so you could consider it on a pen of animals, and probably the most common would be upon arrival in a feed yard. So you may have a pen of animals that comes into your yard that the feedlot has identified together with their consulting veterinarian that it's at high risk of health issues. And that high-risk assessment, is based on a number of things, and certainly we're not the experts on that over in economics, but our animal health experts, and Dave Renner in particular, who is part of this study, they will tell you, that there's a myriad of factors that go into that high-risk categorization for a pen of cattle. It can certainly have to do with the background, where those cattle have come from, how much we know about them. Maybe it's a pen that's been commingled from multiple sources, maybe even has had a stressful hauling and commingling sequence in their background. At any rate, during times when cattle like that are arriving into yards, the feedlot and the consulting veterinarian together need to make an assessment when those cattle arrive as to what the probable health status is. And if they categorize those cattle as high risk, what it means is if you don't do anything with them from a health management perspective upon arrival, and you just take your chances, let's say, and hope that they maintain high health status into the feeding period, a lot of times those cattle end up in a very significantly susceptible state and end up with high death losses, lots of sick animals, lots of pulling and treating going on. And the whole idea behind metaphylaxis is that you treat the whole pen upon arrival for the major ailments that they may be subject to. And by that mass treatment, you've basically increased their resistance. Maybe you even already helped arrest some of the disease incidents that could be there.
The objective here, once again, though, was to attach an economic value to metaphylaxis applications, and so we'll bring Elliott in to discuss the nuts and bolts of the research itself. How do you get at this question, Elliott? Do you have to do some digging for information as well as setting up some economic mechanics here, do you not?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Yeah, we tried to go to the College of Veterinary Medicine and get what we know to be the best information about how metaphylaxis impacts both death loss and morbidity in cattle. And for that, we teamed up with Dave Renner, who's out of the College of Veterinary Medicine. And ideally, we want to find out, how does metaphylaxis impact net return distributions for producers? So if a producer chooses to use metaphylaxis on a pen that's considered high health risk, then what's the probability that they're going to be profitable? And so to do that, we summarized cattle placements into three broad categories. Animals that are weighing about 550 pounds, 700-pound animals, and about 850-pound animals. And on these high health risk animals, they have the option, as Ted mentioned, with consultant veterinarians to either decide whether we should treat these animals with metaphylaxis or to not. And so looking at the difference between these net return distributions, we can actually determine what is the value of metaphylaxis for a given weight category of animals. And so doing so, we actually found that for a 550-pound animal, the value of metaphylaxis is about $105. For a 700-pound animal, it's about $99. And for an 850-pound animal, it's about $64. So lighter weights, metaphylaxis is used more on those types of animals, and so we would expect that they would have greater net returns.
And I might just mention the numbers that Elliott is quoting there are only for those animals that have been categorized as that high-risk status. Now, normal, healthy animals that would come into feed yards would not be subjected to a metaphylaxis treatment because it is a costly investment, and so it's only going to be associated with that percent of animals that are coming in. And as Elliott mentioned, the lighter weight animals are going to have a higher percentage rate of application during different times of the year than will heavier weight placement entries. So it's not all the cattle in the yard for sure that are having this kind of a treatment. It's only those that are coming in with that high health risk status.
There is still another component to this. You did survey feedlots to see what is the frequency of metaphylaxis use, and that will then help attach a further broader value on this, right?
Right, Eric. So working with producers and in the Midwestern states, we were able to obtain some proprietary information, and we compared that metaphylaxis use to that which was reported by National Animal Health Monitoring System in 2011. Some of you producers might have received that survey, and if you did, thank you for participating in that. And we found that if metaphylaxis was taken away from these high health risk cattle, it would reduce industry gross revenue by about 1%. So that's a sizable amount if metaphylaxis was not allowed to be used on high health risk cattle only in feedlots. And we know that reduction in revenue is going to come because of reduced average daily gains. It's going to come because of increased feed conversions, higher health costs from treating sick animals, more deaths primarily for those high health risk animals. And that reduction in profitability will then be passed up and down the beef supply chain, ultimately resulting in higher prices for consumers to pay for beef at the supermarket.
And on both counts, on the producer side and consumer side, if you start adding the numbers up, you're talking about millions of dollars of losses, are you not?
Yeah, so what we're talking about is for beef producers along the supply chain, we're looking at about a $1.8 billion reduction in profits for producers, and overall the consumers who go to the meat counters to purchase their protein products are going to lose about $1 billion. And so it's reducing this in the cattle industry is specifically in the feedlot. It's going to be a sizable impact both on the producer side and consumers who are purchasing.
That is, if metaphylaxis was removed as an alternative for cattle health management.
Yeah, this is all talking about if metaphylaxis were to be removed by policymakers and not allowing for producers to substitute into other health management practices.
So this is important information that hopefully, Ted, will be utilized as future decisions might be made on this particular health management approach in cattle production, right?
It really is, Eric. I mean, any time one goes into assessing benefits and costs of alternative policies, the VFD, Veterinary Feed Directive, is a good example of one that was instituted. And you as you deploy or utilize or consider, evaluate alternative policies, one always has to know what are those benefits and costs potentially if this were to be enacted. And if you remove a animal health technology that's available to the industry now at the feedlot level, a lot of that cost is, of course, absorbed by the feedlot, but a very significant amount of it goes back to the cow-calf producer who's supplying those calves. Even if they're supplying healthy calves, I mean, they are still going to be influenced because overall the feedlot sector's costs get passed. A lot of that gets passed down because they're a margin taker. So it's a very important issue, not only for the feedlot sector, but for the cow-calf sector as well. And as Elliott mentioned, of course, for consumers as well.
Interesting and quite important information generated by this analysis. And gentlemen, thank you for passing along a quick overview of it right here. We do appreciate it.
It's our pleasure.
Over from the Agricultural Economics Department at K-State, livestock economist Ted Schroeder and graduate researcher Elliott Dennis. They have just released this new report on their study of the value of arrival metaphylaxis as a health treatment in the U.S. fed cattle industry. You can read the write-up on this very work now on the agmanager.info website. That is agmanager.info. Do check it out. And you're listening to Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
This is the K-State Radio Network, and welcome back to Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. For today's Kansas wheat harvest update, we concentrate on harvest progress in the Central Kansas Extension District. That's made up of Saline and Ottawa counties. Longtime agricultural agent there, Tom Maxwell, is filling us in on just how far harvest is along. Well, it's not happening today, Tom, for you've rainfall in that area, which is a blessing.
It definitely is, Eric. We're getting some rain here Monday morning, and I'm loving it. We've been kind of a long dry spell going back to last year, and so certainly has slowed harvest up a bit in the northern reaches of Central Kansas Extension District, but we're not complaining.
So prior to the moisture, how far along were your producers in cutting?
In Saline County, we're pretty well wrapped up for the most part. In Ottawa County, probably 80% or better in most areas as you get up into the northern reaches of Ottawa County, northwest Ottawa County. A little more wheat to be cut up there as we had some rain on the 18th and 19th of June, and that slowed folks up. But certainly with the weather predicted, they'll be back in the fields maybe later this week and get things wrapped up.
As this harvest commenced, Tom, what was your thinking on the likely productivity of wheat in the two-county area there?
Sure. It didn't look real good. Of course, we had a combination of things, a dry winter, missed out on a lot of the rains during March and April, so it was extremely dry during the growing season. But expectations were not real high, and certainly that's been borne out with the yields that we're seeing here in Saline County anyway, mostly in the 20s and 30s, up to 40 for the most part. As we get into Ottawa County, caught a few more rains, particularly in the northern part of Ottawa County, 30s, 40s, maybe even into the 50s in northern Ottawa County. So again, all the difference in the world where they got just a little bit more rain.
And test weights, protein contents, what's the read there on those?
Test weights kind of all over the board. We did see some shriveling of the grain here in parts of Saline County, some as low as 50, 51, but for the most part, hearing 57 to 60, even 61 test weight. Proteins, excellent protein year, probably one of the best that I remember in my career. 13%, 13.5% proteins. I've heard as high as 18, but probably around 13.5 would be fairly typical protein this year.
As harvest has been relatively smooth with little interruptions except for the aforementioned rain?
Yes, the rain we had about a week ago has slowed things up, mainly in Ottawa County, but it certainly was a welcome relief. The heat earlier took its toll on the wheat as we lost quite a few of the leaves early on, and then we saw, wheat turning white prematurely. It really wasn't ripening; it was dying prematurely because of the high temperatures. So, heat and drought were a big factor in the lower than average yields that we're seeing coming in this year.
Well, if there was an upside, it was the notable absence of diseases in the crop, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I don't remember a year where I haven't hardly ever seen a pustule of leaf rust or stripe rust. Might have seen one of leaf rust, but did not see any stripe rust this year, so that was a welcome relief.
So as your producers are bringing this crop in, it's generally an attitude of, well, it could have been worse?
I think so. We didn't have real high expectations. We were just hoping that we could cut a respectable crop. Certainly prices are a little higher than they were last year, so that's helping some. But for Saline County anyway, I'd say below average yields overall. Ottawa County approaching average, slightly below in some areas, but average in the northern areas of Ottawa County.
So the attention now turns to the row crops and with heightened hope now that moisture has rolled in.
Certainly, the beans, milo, looking pretty good. The corn was stressing pretty bad here over a week ago before we had the rains. And quite frankly, in some areas, they just haven't gotten as much rain as we have here closer to Salina, and so we're still seeing some corn under stress even last Friday. So hopefully this rain today was more general, and everybody's getting a good soaker before we run the gauntlet again.
And when heat returns this week, that'll give your producers a chance to get back in and maybe tie off this harvest, in another few days?
Oh, I think so. I think if we get dried out, they'll easily be wrapped up here within the week.
Hey, Tom, we appreciate the update. Thank you. We'll talk again soon.
You're welcome, Eric.
With today's wheat harvest update, focusing on Saline and Ottawa counties, which comprise the Central Kansas Extension District, that's Extension Agricultural Agent there, Tom Maxwell. Now it's on to this week's edition of Tree Tales with K-State Forester Bob Atchison. Bob?
The benefits of woodlands, windbreaks, and trees in our Kansas communities is apparent to most people. Even our children could name them: shade, wildlife habitat, forest products, water quality. But some of the benefits are not as visible or direct, and yet they may be the most important. Each year, our Earth's forests and woodlands absorb over 100 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This huge number is equal to 60 times the weight of all the people on our planet. Trees provide the largest terrestrial carbon sink on Earth. Their care and management provides the greatest potential, along with emissions reductions, to bring our carbon cycle back into balance. That includes the 2.5 million acres of forests and the 1.2 million acres of windbreaks, riparian woodlands, and other trees we have here in Kansas. Wayne White, Kansas farmer, woodland owner, and author, provides this important perspective in his book, Biosequestration and Ecological Diversity, Mitigating and Adapting to Climate Change. White suggests even a rapid move away from a fossil fuel-driven energy system will not replace the carbon that we have transferred into our atmosphere for the last 268 years, when the Industrial Revolution introduced the large-scale mining and burning of coal. Unfortunately, our forests are also at risk because of climate change. Drought and insect damage in California alone accounts for the death of 129 million trees, and that's just in the last 4 years. An appropriate response for us here in Kansas would be to avoid the conversion of windbreaks, shelter belts, and riparian forests to cropland or urban development. In fact, research suggests we should be planting more riparian forests and windbreaks for so many reasons beyond the benefits of carbon sequestration. Kansas Forest Service foresters are available to help you manage and care for your woodlands and windbreaks. Why not contact us today at 785-532-3300 or check us out on the web at www.kansasforest.org. This is Bob Atchison. You've been listening to another Tree Tale.
Thanks, Bob. And this is Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Animals, which includes beef and dairy cattle, meat and dairy goats, poultry, rabbits, sheep, swine, dogs, and other pets, is understandably one of the most popular project areas for Kansas 4-H. And with county fairs rapidly approaching, K-State 4-H specialist Pam van Horn says this is an especially busy time for 4-H youth involved in raising, caring for, and managing animals.
I think we just gradually think that, the fair's coming up, they're going to get their animals ready. But what I like about the animal projects is there's so much more than just exhibiting the animal at the fair.
And this is not something that, as you mentioned, starts a couple weeks before the fair. This is something that they're doing day in and day out because these animals, no matter what kind, require a lot of care.
It's day in and day out. I think about when I have visited with bucket calf young people. They're so excited to get up in the morning and feed their calf, or feed it in the morning, feed it in the evening, and they're learning that responsibility. But I think of it's more than just the animal in these livestock projects, is that they can be working year-round, not only taking care of their animal, but they can be learning, too, about what kind of grains they need to feed their animal, what their rations would be. And I think that's what's exciting, too, is it's not just the exhibiting at the fair, but these activities such as Quiz Bowl, Skill-a-thon, lead an opportunity for 4-H'ers to do more than just directly with their animals.
How does this project work for people who aren't familiar with it? Someone is in a 4-H club. They want to do an animal project. How do they get started?
It's a long process, really. When you think about 4-H being a year-long program, it's getting and thinking in advance. If you're joining a 4-H club, when the new 4-H year begins in October, and if you want to take a livestock animal, whether that be a steer, a heifer, a lamb, or even a hog, you have to think in advance because those animals need to be purchased because they have to be at a certain weight at your fair. So usually about November, December, you start looking for your steers. And then for your smaller livestock animals, you'll be looking for those in the spring. Many of those are born after the new year. Many of our 4-H clubs have project leaders, and the project leaders can assist them if they want to get involved. The other thing is that the Animal Science Department, I work closely with Lexi Hayes, and she's been having junior producer days that happened about March of each year, and it's every other year. It may be a different species, but it's a great time for 4-H members to come up and learn more about their livestock projects.
And I guess they understand how the animals are going to be judged. They know the things that are going to be maybe positives with their animals and maybe things that might not be quite where they want to be.
Those are things that 4-H'ers can learn along the way. And I think that is very exciting that they can start knowing what are good traits and what they need to improve on in their animal. And they can learn those by participating in judging contests. Get involved. Go participate in a judging contest so you can learn what those characteristics are that you need to have in your animal to make it the best it possibly can be.
And I know I've been to the Riley County Fair several times, and they get some very instructive advice and judging information from the people who are there doing the judging.
I think many times the judges that our local county agents are selecting to judge the county fairs are very knowledgeable, and it's a wonderful opportunity to listen to what their reasons are of why they placed one animal over another. And if you listen closely, they're trying to teach not only the 4-H member that's exhibiting, but even the audience can pick up some new ideas. So it's a great opportunity just to listen to the knowledge those individuals are sharing.
Are there some things you can tell people who don't have animals, but we like to go to the fair and we like to look at them? Are there some things that we should be aware of when we're around animals?
I think you just need to keep your wits about you. A lot of times when you're visiting the fair, in the cattle, they're tied in the stall. Just be quiet. Don't make a lot of noise or excitement to spook the animals because they're in an environment that they're unaware of. The other thing, and I know that rabbits and chickens are very popular, but because they're in the cages and small children and fairgoers can get right up to the cage, they like to poke and stick their fingers in, and probably not a good idea. It's one of those times it's better to look and observe and not touch.
One of the things I like to do is stop and talk to the youth because they really like to share their story. They'll tell you the name of the animal. They'll tell you how long they've had the animal, all the things they've done to get ready for the fair.
That is the best part of conference judging, and I have done conference judging with bucket calves, and they're usually 7 to 12-year-olds that have raised bucket calves, and they know everything about that calf. They have fed it, they have walked it, they have given it a bath, they've probably given it a name. So our 4-H members really do know quite a bit about their individual animals.
And this is a business. They're also learning the business aspect because a lot of these animals are eventually sold.
They're sold, and that goes for many of them to go back to pay for their feed cost. And if there's a profit made, many of them put that in their savings account, and they're looking towards the future. That may be an investment for them to attend college. So they're really thinking long term.
And they're also thinking about that next animal and the traits they'll look for when they purchase the next animal.
Yes, nothing is more educational than if your animal didn't win and you've listened to the judge and you've listened to other people, and then you get ideas for the next year of what do I need to choose my next animal.
Are there some events coming up that the youth should be aware of?
I think there's a wonderful wealth of opportunities coming up this summer. With horses, there's the district horse shows. That's a qualifying event for those that are enrolled in horse to go to the state fair. There's the junior dairy show that's in August, and along with the dairy show, they have a judging contest, quiz bowl, and a skillathon. Those are different activities that incorporate different feeds and knowledge about the project. And then there's the livestock sweepstakes that will also take place in August. Again, it will include a judging contest, quiz bowl, and a skillathon so that these young people can share their knowledge with others about what they've learned.
That's K-State 4-H specialist Pam van Horn. To learn more about Kansas 4-H, visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.